Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. I'm Emeritus Professor Glenn McConell from Victoria University in Australia, but I'm currently in the University of Copenhagen in Denmark as a Danish Diabetes Academy visiting professor. So I'm realizing I'm going to have to change the background there because that's Melbourne. The goal of Inside Exercise is to bring to you the absolute who's who of exercise research. So the top researchers in the world in exercise physiology, exercise metabolism, and exercise and health. So what I want is for you to get your exercise information from the world-leading researchers rather than influencers. Today, I'm bringing to you Professor Wendy Kohrt from the University of Colorado, who's an absolute expert and the person you first think of when you think of exercise and bone. We all know exercise is good for bone, but interestingly, she's going to point out that during exercise, especially prolonged exercise, you can actually get breakdown of bone. And that's something that really should be considered. I found it really interesting, so stick around.
Hi, Wendy. How are you? Welcome to Inside Exercise.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to finally be here with you.
Oh, yeah. You're a busy person. And we'll talk about your bone research, of course, but also I don't even know how to say it, the molecular transducers of physical exercise. I know you're heavily involved with that as well.
Yeah,
How do you say that acronym?
MoTrPAC.
Yes. Oh, that's a good name. I like that. Yeah, I had Scott Trappy on a bit ago, and he's involved with that as well. So yeah, it's interesting. So we're going to talk about how bone is actually catabolic during exercise, or can be, and that's going to be really interesting because people know exercise is good for the bone, but if you're saying it's actually during exercise, it might be breaking down bone perhaps. But first of all, I just want to get a bit of a background. So you're in Colorado, maybe a bit of a background where you're at, and how you actually got into the research. Were you an exercise person initially, a sports person, then you got interested in exercise research, or were you a researcher first, then you got into exercise? How did you end up where you're at?
I got here through good fortune and a lot of opportunities that were created for me. I was an athlete in college. I played both volleyball and basketball, but that was before the time that women in the United States were allowed to participate in the NCAA.
Really?
So it was eons ago, but athletics was, it gave me the self-confidence that I had lacked at that point in my life, made me realize that I could do things that I never thought I could do before. And it just set me on a path in life that I don't think I would have been on had I not been an athlete. And initially I majored in physical education and math as an undergrad, and I taught junior high math for 4 years and coached at the senior high level. I coached volleyball, basketball, and softball. And when I went to Arizona State to get my master's in exercise science, it was with the intent of trying to get a college coaching position. But while I was there, the Board of Regents in Arizona approved a doctoral program in exercise science. And Jim Skinner, who had joined the faculty recently, asked me if I would stay and be his first doctoral student in the program. And I agreed to do that, still not quite knowing what my career path looked like. But probably, 6 months before I was going to finish, I was meeting with Jim, one of our regular meetings, and he started out by saying, "So Wendy, what are you going to do after you graduate?" And before I could even say, "I don't know," he said, "I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to go to Washington University in St. Louis and do a postdoctoral fellowship with John Holloszy." And at the time I thought,
awesome.
Gosh, yeah, it was awesome. And I was thinking there's, no way John would bring me into that illustrious lab, but John and Jim had connections that went back to the 1960s, their public health service time. And so I started my postdoctoral fellowship in the Holloszy lab and ended up staying there for 13 years. So I moved to a faculty position, and that was, it was just such a a fertile training opportunity and a place to develop my career. I learned so much during that time, but decided to leave there in 1999. I was recruited to come out to Colorado, and so I've been here almost 24 years, and this has also been an absolutely exceptional place for me to carry out the rest of my career. I'll tell you how I got interested in bone, because I remember the day it happened. John had a program project, so multi-project NIH grant that was focused on physiological adaptations to exercise in the elderly, with elderly then being age 60 or older. And this would have been in 1989. He was in the process of starting his competing renewal application, and DEXA instruments, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, the instrument that's used to measure bone density in humans, had just come on the market recently. So for the first time, we were able to precisely measure bone mineral density at regions of the skeleton, the hip and the spine, that are very susceptible to osteoporotic fractures. So I ran into John in the hallway one day, and he stopped me and said, "Wendy, we need to have a bone project in the next version of the program project. And since you're the only woman in the lab, you're the appropriate person to take the lead on that." Well, there's a lot of things wrong with that statement, but at the time, I was actually doing glucose and fat metabolism studies. But my thought, I didn't say this out loud, but my thought was, gosh, watching bones grow is as exciting as watching grass grow, except grass grows faster. But it was an extremely opportune time. So I agreed to do this. And I wasn't actually the lead, because I was still a postdoc, just going to be transitioning to an assistant professor. But I would work closely with an endocrinologist on this project, Stan Burge. And it turned out to be a great opportunity for me, because it was funded. At that time, you had to submit an R award to the NIH before you could actually submit a K award, a career development award. So I submitted an R29 application right after that, and I got that funded. So this really set me on a career path for success. And I've managed to keep my bone research funded since 1990. And it was that early work that really got me thinking that, unlike a lot of other adaptations to exercise, it was very difficult to predict who was going to respond favorably in terms of changes in bone mineral density. I was doing studies in women at that time. There were some women who were great exercisers. They had, these remarkable increases in VO2 max, improvements in other health parameters, and they would end up having a decrease, a loss of bone over their exercise training. So I got thinking very early on that there must be factors that we're missing that are determinants of how bone responds to exercise. And so I've started looking at some of those. Some of my work 10 to 15 years ago was focused on the use of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Because when I started working on this first grant for John, I remember being in the library, because he actually had to go to the library to get journal articles in those days, and seeing a paper in 1989 that indomethacin blocked the bone formation response in animals, in rats. Indomethacin is an NSAID. And, that got me thinking, well, geez, almost everybody I know who exercises regularly pops ibuprofen, like their chiclets. And if that actually does block the bone formation response, that could be an important determinant of why bone sometimes fails to adapt as we might expect. And we have done studies to show that NSAID use primarily before exercise could be deleterious for bone. And that's because prostaglandin E2 is an essential signaling factor in the activation of bone formation. And in the animal studies, when you block that before mechanical stress is applied to bone, there is essentially no bone formation response generated. Whereas if you introduce that NSAID after the exercise or the stress has been applied to bone, then you don't get the full response, but you get a nearly complete bone formation response.
So this is the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. So you're saying you actually need inflammation during exercise. Is that essentially?
Well, you need prostaglandin E2. NSAIDs work by blocking cyclooxygenase, the enzyme that generates prostaglandins. So if you diminish the availability of prostaglandin E2 specifically, that could limit how bone responds to mechanical loading.
And prostaglandins play a role in blood flow too, don't they?
They play a role in many things.
Many. It's interesting that came up because I've had a couple of people on talking about muscle injuries and how people take anti-inflammatories and how, the timing of it. So it's kind of similar to what you're saying, the timing of it, because you want to actually have if you've done an injury, you actually want to have an inflammatory response. So it's maybe not always good to block it. Now, if I could step back a bit, it's very interesting because John Holloszy, is a legend, of course, he was. He's passed away, but with mitochondria and then glucose uptake. And during my PhD and my career, I was looking at glucose uptake during exercise and the regulation of it. And the classic paper that I'd often be quoting was Andy Coggin's paper, with glucose uptake being lower during exercise after training. And you're on that. So it's really quite interesting that you could have quite very easily, if you weren't a female, I guess, been working on glucose metabolism or mitochondrial function, but as you said, you got a niche.
It did carve out a unique path for me to follow that no one else in our lab had been going down. Actually, Gail Dulski had been at WashU before I got there, and she had done a study on exercise and bone while I was there. So I got some knowledge by working side by side with Gail, but she left shortly thereafter. So I was free to carve out my own path.
Well, you're definitely the person I always think of when I think about exercise and bone. So you've had a great effect on me anyway. So we talked a little bit before we started, how we might talk about this. So talk about what's happening with bone, during exercise, so during the actual exercise, and then after the exercise, and then naturally the chronic effects, which people tend to think about more. So can we sort of start with that? So what's actually happening during exercise, like hormonal changes, etc., blood flow that's affecting bone and calcium levels and loss of calcium and sweat, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, let me tell you the story about how we ended up where we are today. I think in 2004, 2005, I had an internist join my lab who thought he wanted to get some clinical research experience. This was Dan Barry. He was a former competitive road cyclist, and road cyclists cyclists as a group of athletes tend to have low bone mineral density. So Dan was very interested in that. And for his first independent project, he decided to follow a group of competitive road cyclists for a year and measure their bone density roughly every 3 months. So in Colorado, it's about 9 months competitive season and training, and then 3 months off season, but they're able to ride most of the year. So it isn't really too much of an off season. And I think the dogma at that point was that cyclists didn't get the benefits of weight-bearing exercise, because cycling is a weight-supported exercise. So they just didn't have high bone mineral density. But Dan actually showed that their bone mineral density decreased over time. And looking just at the hip, it was almost a 2% decrease, which is not unlike the accelerated rate of bone loss that we see in postmenopausal women after the loss of ovarian estrogens. And these were young men, 20 to 40 years of age. They shouldn't have been losing any bone. So this was the first hint that it's not that they just don't get the benefit of exercise, that there's actually something causing them to lose bone. And we sat down and talked through some potential hypotheses on what we thought could be happening. One thought was that during the exercise per se, since, you know, cyclists spend, especially competitive cyclists, spend a lot of time on their bikes, that there are increases in stress hormones and inflammatory markers, and many of those have pro-resorptive effects on bone. They cause bone breakdown. They increase bone resorption. So that was plausible. We also thought that over a period of time in training, maybe there is conditions of low energy availability that may or may not result in weight loss. Just low energy availability without weight loss can increase bone resorption. And if there is weight loss, we almost always see bone loss accompanying weight loss. And then a third factor that is in this grouping is that if there is low energy availability for a persistent period of time, that typically suppresses the gonadal axis. So there can be decreases in androgens and estrogens. And both of those also would be predicted to increase catabolic activity in bone.
Can we just
so
clarify
that
for
was
people?
plausible.
Sorry, can we clarify for people? So in males, you say lower testosterone, and females, can we just clarify what we're talking about with what hormone?
Yeah, both low testosterone in men, and it may not be the testosterone because testosterone is converted to estrogen. So if there's low testosterone, there's probably also low estrogen levels. It's probably the low estrogen that is specifically affecting bone, but testosterone also affects bone. And in women, it's low estrogen levels. Both of those get suppressed.
And can I clarify, were you saying the 2% over the year, you know, and there was a control group that had no change, or like what?
We didn't have a control group, but there have certainly been studies that have done serial measurements of bone in non-athletes of this age. So, you know, from the ages of 20 to 40, you wouldn't expect to see any remarkable changes in bone mineral density in men over a 1-year time span.
Okay, and 2% is quite substantial. Yeah. Okay.
It is. It is. So we had two good areas that we thought were plausible to look at. But the third one, and this was Dan's idea, was to look at calcium loss, dermal calcium loss during exercise, because athletes sweat a lot. There's calcium in sweat. If cyclists are spending 20 hours on their bikes, they could be losing substantial amounts of calcium through sweating. I let Dan pick which of these three areas he wanted to pursue. I had put them in the order that I thought was most likely, you know, the inflammatory cytokines, disruption of energy balance, and then loss of dermal calcium. But he picked the last one. And boy, am I glad he did, because this has proven to be I just shake my head at what we've learned over the last 10 to 15 years in this area. So we developed a working model one of the things I require in my lab. So the hypothesis was that dermal calcium loss during an exercise session would result in a decrease in the serum calcium level. And serum calcium is something that our bodies defend very vigorously, because if calcium levels drop too low, initially you can just have some muscle cramping types of problems. But if they drop too far, the heart is a muscle, calcium is necessary for muscle contraction. One of the consequences can be cardiac arrest. So if there is a decrease in serum calcium during exercise, we have to have a very robust counter-regulatory mechanism to make sure that it doesn't decrease to harmful levels. So as soon as serum calcium levels start to decrease by just very small amounts, within minutes, you get an increase in parathyroid hormone secretion, PTH. And PTH can conserve or defend serum calcium levels three ways. It can work on the kidney to reduce urinary calcium excretion. It can work on the gut to enhance calcium absorption, or it can go to the calcium bank. It can go to bone and mobilize calcium to make it immediately available. And that third one is the one that happens the fastest. So we postulated that as serum calcium declined, PTH would go up, and that would then trigger a catabolic effect in bone to mobilize calcium and make sure that serum calcium levels do not decrease to harmful levels. From that point, we designed a series of experiments to test this whole model. So the first experiment we did was the one testing whether it really is dermal calcium loss that is the primary trigger of this. So our experiment was done in a metabolic chamber where we could control the temperature. We picked a warm temperature and a cool temperature, and I don't remember exactly what they were, but based on what was in the literature, that temperature difference, the warmer temperature should provoke a sweat response that was about 50% greater than in the cool condition. And in fact, that's exactly what we saw. The sweat rate, the estimated sweat volume, was twice as high during the warm condition than the cool condition. So this was 60 minutes of relatively vigorous cycling at about 75 to 80% of maximal heart rate. So we had a group of men and women, 20 to 40 years of age. I think sample size was about 24, who did two identical exercise bouts, one in a warm condition, one in a cool condition. And the primary endpoints for this were the decrease in serum ionized calcium, the free calcium in blood, increase in PTH, and increase in CTX. And all three of those things
sorry,
happened.
can we just say what CTX is?
Oh, CTX, yeah. That's the primary marker of bone breakdown that we use. It's a biomarker of bone resorption, and it's actually one of the collagen fragments. So it is an indicator of bone resorption occurring in bone.
Okay, cool.
So we saw a decrease in serum calcium, we saw an increase in PTH, and we saw an increase in CTX. What was surprising to me in this experiment is I think we were actually doing serum calcium measurements every 15 minutes in this experiment. We had a handheld point of care device, the iStat, where we can actually measure serum ionized calcium bedside. And I was expecting that there would be this decrease in serum calcium. I didn't know exactly when we would see it, because we had only done measurements and experiments before this, before and after an exercise bout. But we actually started to see the decline in serum calcium 15 minutes into an exercise bout.
15?
15, yes.
Wow, that's quick.
Yes, it was much faster than I expected, which was the first indicator that it can't be dermal calcium loss. It can't be sweating that's provoking this, because 15 minutes into exercise, they're sweating, but they haven't lost that much calcium through sweat. So that was the first hint that we were wrong with that part of our experiment. The second indicator that we were wrong is that there were no differences in either the decrease in calcium, the increase in PTH, or the increase in CTX with exercise between the warm and cool conditions.
Okay.
But I mean, everything else in our model was correct. It was just the first step, that it was dermal calcium loss triggering this, that was wrong. A couple of important other things that we learned from that experiment. First, PTH kept going up during exercise. It peaked about 15 minutes after exercise. And we had these people stay for 1 hour after they finished their 1 hour exercise bout. And at an hour after exercise, it looked like PTH was already going down, but it looked like CTX was just hitting its peak. So that told us we needed to follow them a little longer to find out what was happening with bone resorption more persistently. The other thing that we learned was that, you know, anytime you go and exercise, especially somewhat vigorously, there's a contraction of plasma volume. So anytime you see an increase in any of the solid constituents in the vascular space, we always correct for plasma volume shifts to know whether that's a true increase in the content of that constituent or not. So we adjusted for plasma volume contraction and didn't really see any change, any differences in the results for PTH or CTX. But it was a remarkable effect on what happened with serum calcium. So we knew that serum calcium was going down. Actually, we see a small blip, an increase in the first 5 minutes, but that's due to the contraction of plasma volume. And after that, calcium was decreasing. When we adjusted for that decrease in plasma volume, the change in serum ionized calcium was profound. Within the first 15 minutes of exercise, there is a 1 milligram per deciliter decrease in serum ionized calcium content. That means, you know, about half of calcium in blood is bound, half is ionized calcium, unbound. So about, 4.5 milligrams per deciliter.
Oh,
that goes down to 3.5 milligrams per deciliter.
So it's like a quarter almost. Yeah, wow.
Well, yeah, 20 to 25% of this unbound calcium is leaving the vascular space.
Sorry, and how quick was that?
That's in the first 15 minutes of exercise.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, that's.
I thought this was a new discovery. I certainly had never been aware
That's
that
new to me anyway.
happened. But then I started looking at the literature. And I found a paper, I think, from the 1980s from, I think it's a Hungarian group, Baceda. And they reported almost exactly the same thing. 1 milligram per deciliter decrease, maybe with an hour of exercise or 30 minutes. And then I looked back a little bit further and I found a paper from Vic Convertino back in the 1970s, and he had reported this decrease in serum ionized calcium content. And going back a little further, John Greenleaf had reported this.
Another famous
So it was not a new observation, but it certainly was just, there were just these sporadic papers. Nobody had ever followed through on this. So this was in our next experiment. we wanted to find out if the decrease in serum ionized calcium, without knowing where it's going, if that was really the trigger for the rest of the metabolic cascade that we were seeing. So we wanted to design an experiment where we could prevent the decline in serum calcium during exercise. And we had already done some oral calcium supplementation before exercise. That is somewhat effective, but not fully effective. So we decided to develop a calcium clamp, where we would infuse calcium gluconate intravenously. We started the infusion about 15 minutes before exercise, so we could actually raise the serum ionized calcium level. We wanted to get an increase of about 0.2 milligrams per deciliter, just so we had a cushion. We didn't want it to decrease below the pre-exercise ionized calcium level. And then using this handheld point of care device that we had, we measured serum ionized calcium every 5 minutes, and we'd adjust the infusion rate to make sure that serum calcium didn't decrease. We were successful in developing that clamp method. We prevented a decrease in serum ionized calcium in all of the participants we did. I think there were 12 men in this study, young men. And for the control condition, we knew that volume could affect some of the outcomes we were interested in. So we always did the calcium clamp first. And then we did a volume matched control day where we infused half normal saline at the same rates, changes at the same times.
Same osmolarity, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, close, not exact, but close.
Okay.
So we thought it was the best control condition that we could develop for this experiment. So we had clamp and control conditions. And with our control condition, we saw exactly what we had seen in our first thermal experiment: initial small increase in serum ionized calcium and then a steady decline. We saw as soon as ionized calcium started to decrease, PTH went up. As soon as PTH started going up, CTX started going up. They both peaked at about the same time. PTH peaked about 15 minutes after exercise and then came screaming back down to baseline by an hour after exercise. This experiment, we followed people for 4 hours of recovery. CTX increased about 1 hour after exercise, but it plateaued. At 4 hours after exercise, there was no hint that it was starting to come back down. We considered whether CTX just has a long half-life, so not being cleared yet. And I've only been able to find one paper on this, but I think the half-life of CTX is only 1 hour. So it should have been coming back down.
That suggests there's continued breakdown even after.
It does. One other factor we considered is whether renal clearance might be impaired by the exercise. So I consulted some renal experts here in Colorado who do exercise research, and they said, no, this 1 hour of exercise shouldn't have an effect on clearance. So we don't think that was it, which means it was continued increased rate of bone resorption. And I still don't know how that happens. It happens very quickly. 15 minutes into exercise, the rate of resorption is increasing and producing more of this byproduct, CTX, this collagen fragment that indicates the rate of resorption has increased. And I don't think anyone is studying how the rate of resorption can be acutely increased in bone, which I think is really important, because for those of you who might be listening to this who know anything about bone metabolism, there's typically a coupling of resorptive activity with formation activity. And this happens over, several months of a bone resorption or bone remodeling cycle, where the bone resorbing cells, the osteoclasts, come in first. They do their job. And then the bone forming cells come in weeks later. These are osteoblasts, and start laying down the matrix to replace that bone that has been chewed away. So if during this cycle, the rate of resorption that is being controlled by the osteoclasts, I don't know if there's any way to ensure that if that's accelerated, that there's a way to appropriately couple that with increased formation rate later. I don't think we have any knowledge of whether that might happen or how it happens. So this was very eye-opening for us, that bone responds much more quickly than I think anybody had anticipated, at least clinical scientists. That the catabolic response was much more profound than I certainly expected. And we still don't know how long that acute increase in catabolism persists. We're doing those experiments now, but we don't have an answer.
That's really interesting. Can I ask, this is cycling, is it the same, do you get the same with running? Because, you tend to, as you indicated, cyclists aren't carrying their body weight much.
Right.
Especially,
right.
I know professional cyclists, they ride for like 5 or 6 hours, and then they want to lay on the couch.
Yeah, they avoid weight-bearing activity.
Exactly. So what about if you do running? Is it a similar thing, or?
Well, great setup question, Glenn. It's like
I didn't mean to set you up.
Well, it's like we planned it. We didn't.
Oh, okay.
But at that point, we had done most of our experiments in young adults, pretty highly trained, and all cycling. So we decided to go to the other end of the extreme, and we decided to do treadmill exercise in older adults, and not necessarily master athletes. These are just people who were accustomed to walking for an hour. So we repeated our calcium clamp exercise with 60-plus-year-olds walking on the treadmill for an hour at 75 to 80% of their maximal heart rate. So similar type of stress in terms of duration and intensity of exercise, just changed the mode, just changed the population we were looking at this in. And, when we've written grants and manuscripts, people still think that, this is still, vigorous exercise that applies only to master athletes, not the average person. But getting an older adult to a heart rate that's 75 to 80% of their max, that was an average walking speed of 3.6 miles per hour, 0% grade. This is not superhuman levels of exercise. It's what many older adults engage in. So it's pretty typical, even though it's brisk walking. And we saw exactly the same responses with the calcium clamp study as in our younger adult study. And I don't think I actually said this. Our calcium clamp prevented 80% of the increases in PTH and CTX. So it was the definitive evidence that it really is the initial disruption in calcium homeostasis that is the trigger for the catabolic response that's generated in bone.
So to bring that together, make sure everyone's on the page there. So you're saying that the initial drop in calcium in the first 15 minutes that causes the PTH increase and the bone breakdown with you're measuring the CTX. If you prevent that reduction in calcium, then you don't get the increase in PTH and you don't get the bone breakdown.
Exactly. We prevent 80% of it. There's still a small increase in resorption. And based on some studies in the literature, some studies that were done in dogs and beagles, where they controlled the state of metabolic acidosis. It does look like metabolic acidosis per se can trigger an increase in PTH. So because we were doing vigorous exercise, in one of our experiments, we did measure lactate. We do see an increase. So we think that that is what's responsible for the small increase that we saw during the calcium clamp condition when we prevented the decrease in serum calcium.
Okay. And are you saying you don't actually know where the calcium's going still?
We don't. I initially talked to some muscle biologists here at Colorado, and they thought, no, it can't be going to muscle because muscle calcium levels are regulated too tightly. But I've done some reading, and this is a difficult area for me to try to drill down into, because if you do a PubMed search putting in calcium, exercise, and muscle, you get thousands and thousands of hits.
Yeah.
But what I've seen probably over the last 10 years or so is that there are more people talking about mitochondrial calcium homeostasis. So my current hypothesis is that calcium is regulated, calcium homeostasis is regulated on two levels. We know that it's regulated systemically because if serum calcium decreases, you get an immediate increase in PTH. So that's a clear level of regulation. But my thought is that there may also be a regulation at the mitochondrial level. And I don't know a lot of the molecular biology of how this happens, only, what I've read and what I can digest of these molecular pathways. But calcium isn't metabolized. It's recycled. It's a mineral, but it's recycled across the mitochondrial matrix. So my thought is that when exercise starts and we have to increase our rate of energy production, so if it's with vigorous exercise, that's a fairly substantial increase in the rate of energy production, that the rate of recycling of calcium has to increase at the level of the mitochondria. And if that rate is increasing, I don't know what the signaling, what the receptor is, what would be sensing this, but I think there would be a sensing that we need to bring more calcium in to sustain this higher rate of recycling. So my thought is that there's a pull of calcium into the mitochondrial space coming from serum calcium, knowing that we need it here. There are regulatory mechanisms at the systemic level that can make sure that serum calcium is not going to decrease to a harmful level. I think it makes sense.
Calcium transport. I guess I've never thought about that. Are there calcium transporters in muscle?
Don't ask me those questions. There are. There are at least channels. Transport channels.
That's true. That's true. What I was thinking about, because I can't, because I've done a lot of glucose metabolism stuff, and you've, started in John Hollossy's lab. So when you're talking about clamping calcium, I can't help thinking about clamping glucose, which, we've done with insulin, etc. But also glucose tracer studies, which I've done. So has anyone done glucose tracer studies in animals or humans and then seen where the actual calcium tracer studies in humans or animals, and actually seen what's happening to calcium appearance, calcium disappearance, and does it end up in muscle, for example?
We're getting ready to publish our calcium isotope paper.
Okay.
We did a very similar experiment. I think we went back to cycling for this experiment, just because a little less movement, easier to control some things. So the model for this experiment was we wanted to give two different calcium isotopes. So we used calcium 42 and calcium 44, and I don't remember which one for which path, but we gave one orally. So we had, and we did two different calcium supplementation doses through a meal. So 4 hours before an exercise bout, participants, and each participant did both conditions, had a calcium enriched meal. And I think that was 1,000 milligrams of calcium in that meal, or a low calcium meal. And I think that was 200 milligrams. And to both of those, we added 15 milligrams of the calcium isotope. So that enabled us to look at the appearance of that tracer in the bloodstream as an index of calcium absorption from the gut. And that we did that 4 hours before, because we wanted to know when we would start seeing the appearance of this calcium, how long it took to get into the small intestine where most calcium absorption occurs. And so about 2 hours before exercise, we started seeing an increase in isotope enrichment. We also then gave an intravenous calcium isotope so that we could look at the calcium kinetics, the rate of turnover, the rate of appearance, the rate of disappearance. It's a little bit more complicated than a typical glucose kinetic model because calcium's coming from multiple places. But basically what we saw is that the rate of calcium absorption can go up dramatically during exercise. 40 years ago in my exercise physiology course in grad school, I learned that blood flow to the gut went down during exercise. So you really didn't absorb many nutrients during exercise. But I think our paper will show that at least for calcium, when there's a need for it, we have the capacity to increase calcium absorption substantially during exercise. And that the higher calcium load, so 1,000 milligrams of calcium before exercise, increases the amount of calcium compared to a low calcium condition. So I think that provides us with the evidence that calcium supplementation before exercise, if we determine we want to prevent the increase in PTH and the increase in CTX, then using calcium supplementation before exercise may be somewhat effective in doing so.
I thought early on though, you said that you said you'd tried calcium, supplementation during exercise and it didn't have much effect. So
it's not as effective as doing an IV infusion.
Oh, fair enough too.
It's also just taking in calcium during the exercise is not effective. So it needs to get down into the small intestine where it can be absorbed. So we think that the window of time, things go through the small intestine pretty quickly once they get there. So we think the window of time is probably an hour to 2 hours before exercise. If you're going to take a calcium supplement or have a calcium enriched snack of some type, if you can continue to take calcium then during exercise, we've shown that that's ideal, but that's not really practical. Calcium is difficult to get into solution. That's why many of the sports drinks have very little, if any, calcium in them. And the drinks that do tend to have a higher calcium may not be very palatable during exercise. I don't think people like to drink milk while they're exercising. So there are some practical challenges there.
That's interesting. So again, just back to when I said, what about if you do running? So you ended up having older people doing walking, but I guess that's still not much sort of stress on the bones. Has anyone done running, like young people that can actually smash it out on a treadmill?
Yeah, we have not, but the group in the UK, Craig Sales' group, has done running. They see similar responses that we see. They do a correction. They don't do a plasma volume correction. They do another albumin-related correction for serum calcium that I think is counteractive to what the effects of plasma volume contraction are on serum calcium. So it might look like we have slightly different results, but I actually think we see very consistent responses.
I can't help thinking that the last person I put up on the podcast is David Kostel. So when you talk about plasma volume, that was something we always did at Ball State, was with exercise, we'd do the plasma volume correction, the Dawn Kostel.
Yeah.
Is that what you're doing? So with hemoglobin and hematocrit changes?
Actually, we did some initial experiments, just 1 or 2 studies where we did both hemoglobin and hematocrit, but at least in those studies we were doing then using hematocrit only, and the von Beaumont equation gave us very similar results. And we did that just for cost effectiveness. The grant that we had, we were running out of money. But based on, I've read the Dylan Kostel papers, and by using hematocrit only, if anything, I think we are underestimating the magnitude of plasma volume contraction, which means we're underestimating the magnitude of calcium loss from the vascular space. So it could be even more robust than the extremely robust response that we see.
So at the moment, anyone could be forgiven to thinking, well, exercise is bad for bone. But have we got that all wrong, that exercise helps maintain bone mass? Or
yeah, here's where it gets a little stickier, a little bit more complicated. So PTH is an unusual hormone. And I don't know who discovered this initially, because it must have been a scientist who was extremely stubborn and married to a hypothesis. But PTH actually has paradoxical actions on bone. If it's elevated chronically, like in primary or secondary hyperparathyroidism, people who have that condition almost always develop osteoporosis. So chronically elevated PTH is toxic to bone. But if the increase in PTH is transient, it is then anabolic to bone.
There you go.
And I don't know of any studies in humans, but in animal studies, the critical factor seems to be the duration of time PTH is elevated. So if it is elevated longer than 4 to 5 hours, that seems to be when it transitions from being anabolic to catabolic. So the increase in PTH that we see with exercise is definitely transient. We've done an hour of exercise, it's elevated all that time, but it comes back down to baseline within another hour. So it's elevated about 2 hours.
Okay.
It should be anabolic. I think we've published one study on this, but you really have to do a training study given the nature of how resorption and formation are coupled in bone. If we cause an increase in resorption at this point in time, we may not see the increase in formation until weeks down the road. I should back up here. PTH is so effective when it's increased transiently at turning on bone formation that there are actually 2 FDA-approved medications that are PTH analogs that are used to treat osteoporosis. So those are teriparatide and abaloparatide, PTH
A
anabolic.
transient increase in PTH. Okay.
Yes, so daily injection to cause a transient increase in PTH signaling. And to give you an idea of just how anabolic those drugs are, over a 12-week period of time, so daily injection of teriparatide, 20 micrograms a day, the biomarker of bone formation that we measure in blood is P1NP, another one of these fragments of bone metabolism. Over 12 weeks, there is an increase in P1NP of 150% in response to teriparatide.
Mm-hmm.
So I've looked in the literature to find exercise intervention studies that are also 12 weeks in duration, where they measured P1NP before and after training. I think I found 5 studies, and all 5 have measured P1NP. 4 of the 5 actually did see an increase in P1NP, but the magnitude was maybe 5% as compared to 150% with pharmacologic increases in PTH through teriparatide. So I don't know why a pharmacologic intervention that increases PTH signaling would be much more anabolic than a physiologic increase in PTH, exercise-induced increase. But at least at this point in time, they seem to generate very different responses, with the catabolic effects of PTH in bone being predominant with exercise. We're doing what I think will be the definitive experiment to prove that or disprove it right now. So hopefully we'll have an answer in about a year.
So maybe that was my next question. So I guess what you're saying then is people that ride 5 hours a day, so Tour de France type people, are going to be losing bone, which has been shown, as you said, by DEXA. But people shouldn't be afraid to, cycle 1 hour a day, which is what most people do, because they'd be getting the transient changes in PTH. And has that actually been shown, or?
I've bared my soul to a lot of people, given what we've learned over the last few years. I feel professionally conflicted right now, recommending exercise for bone health, knowing what I know about how exercise can turn on bone catabolism. My thought is that we know that the acute response of bone can be both catabolic and anabolic. I mean, we also have a wealth of evidence that bone formation can be turned on acutely by exercise. So both of these competing processes can be turned on. So I think the net effect of exercise over time on bone is going to be the synthesis of how these two opposing processes are being turned on. So I would think that if you're doing a weight-supported exercise, like cycling or swimming, that may not turn on bone formation as effectively as a weight-supported or a weight-bearing exercise, and you're getting this catabolic effect, that might be a condition where over time you could lose bone, or at least not gain bone. There might be a neutral effect or a harmful effect. If you're doing weight-bearing exercise, maybe that's generating enough of an anabolic signal to counteract the catabolic signal. So then those individuals could end up having the small increases in bone mineral density that we tend to see in response to weight-bearing exercise interventions. There are never dramatic increases in bone. They tend to be small. And I think it's because of these competing catabolic and anabolic pathways getting activated. And then there's one more factor here. It's still possible that the increase in PTH is anabolic. We're doing what I think is the definitive experiment now. So I don't want to rule that out yet, even though I don't think the available evidence points to it being a strong anabolic factor. But I think we have to entertain that, just knowing that transient increases in PTH signaling induced by pharmacologics is very anabolic to bone.
You're not going to tell us the definitive study you're doing now, by the sounds of it. Is that okay? I
can tell you that we're doing most of our work in this area has been with just 1 or 2 bouts of exercise. So we're now doing a study with 16 bouts of exercise, ideally over 4 weeks. So this is a VA funded study. So we're enrolling veterans, and ideally they will do 4 exercise bouts a week for 4 weeks. We'll be looking at the profile of increases or changes in both in PTH, CTX, the resorption biomarker, and P1NP, the formation marker. So we'll be doing this phenotypic profiling with the first exercise bout, the 8th exercise bout, and the 16th exercise bout. The first thing we want to show is that the catabolic response occurs after each of these and that it remains robust. We do not think this is something that goes away with training. We think that this response is there to protect serum calcium, to prevent it from decreasing to harmful levels. So we'll show that the increase in CTX occurs repeatedly, so that catabolic effect that we've shown occurs in young and old, men, women, trained, untrained, cycling, treadmill. It's always there. So that will be the indication of its catabolic potential. The other thing we're going to look at is the increase in pre-exercise P1NP across these 4 weeks. Because I told you about the increase in P1NP in response to 12 weeks of teriparatide therapy, but just 28 days of teriparatide generates an increase in P1NP of almost 100%. Our hypothesis is that the increase in P1NP with 4 weeks of exercise is only going to be about 5%, much less than what we would expect to teriparatide. And we are going to submit a grant where we do a head-to-head comparison of teriparatide and exercise in the same type of cohort, young adults, so that we can do a direct comparison of how pharmacologic versus physiologic PTH affects bone metabolism, but that's down the road a ways.
Okay. So that's very interesting. I spoke to you briefly before we started that I had done a little bit, so bringing a glucose metabolism in the bone together with it's a guy called Itamar Levinger, Victoria University. We looked at exercise, osteocalcin, and glucose metabolism. So I guess without getting into that too much, is there other effects of bone, so the markers that are released that aren't simply markers? Are they actually doing anything, or do we know that? Do they have it? Because there's a lot of crosstalk that we think about now with muscle talking to liver, and is bone talking to muscle, or maybe it's calcium is talking to the muscle. Who knows?
I think we're probably in a situation with bone that we were in with adipose tissue, 30 years ago. We thought adipose tissue was an inert tissue that just stored fat.
Yeah, exactly.
And we know that's not the case. And we used to think that bone was relatively inert, did not respond very quickly to anything. It was primarily just a storage organ.
We used to talk about it like chalk. You break your
Yeah,
bones.
exactly. And I think we're learning now that it is much more dynamic than at least I thought it was. It can respond in 10 minutes to the onset of exercise. And that some of the factors that might be produced in bone, like osteocalcin, might have effects in adjacent tissues like muscle. Certainly, Gerard Carcenti has shown that that's a possibility. I would like to see that work translated to humans. I'm not going to be the one to do that, so I hope somebody takes that challenge on.
So is it fair to say, because I remember with bone, there was always the talk that the main thing was to get a high peak bone mass. So, during childhood and up to early 20s, etc. And then that was much more important for your lifetime bone mass. And then exercise might be just tweaking around. Is that fair to say that's still the way people are thinking? Or
yeah, I think that's the general model. We end up losing bone. We used to refer to type 1 and type 2 osteoporosis. So what we see in women is, well, let's start with just children and adults. During childhood, you accrue bone as the skeleton is developing. So you get to your peak bone mass. Girls probably hit that sooner than boys do, maybe by late teens, early 20s. Women have hit their peak bone mass. Men, it might be delayed a little bit, a few more years. But, that kind of determines where your aging loss trajectory starts from. And I think there's some evidence that you may be able to maintain that peak bone mass into potentially the 5th decade, so till you get up to about age 50. At that point in women with the menopause transition, estrogen has an extremely potent effect on bone metabolism. So the loss of ovarian estrogens, even though there are other estrogens still in the system, that loss of ovarian estradiol production causes an accelerated rate of bone loss that really persists for quite a while. But there's also age-related bone loss, much like there is muscle-related bone loss. And for anybody working in aging research, I refer to primary versus secondary effects of aging. Primary aging effects are those that are inevitable. They happen in everyone. They can't be avoided. And I actually use the menopause as a great example of a primary aging event in women. It happens at about the same age, plus or minus, 5 years. It can't be avoided. It is an aging event. But there are other aging factors, probably primary aging, that contribute to the loss of muscle and bone and other loss of function. Some of the rate of decline in bone mineral density that we see in the general population is probably related to secondary factors of aging. We tend to become less active as we get older. And whether that's primary aging or secondary aging, whether we could avoid it or not, I think remains debatable. So there are a lot of factors that are influencing the rate at which we lose bone. But where you start from is a key factor. So bone mass.
And what about calcium? I managed to crash my bicycle and break my neck of femur, which wasn't much fun. And the person that I was collaborating with at the time, the osteocalcin stuff, he's like a major person on the Osteoporosis Council, the World Osteoporosis Council. He looked at the DEXA and said, you must have low bone mass. And I do have quite low bone mass. Anyway, he wasn't very happy because he prescribed me calcium. He told me to have calcium and vitamin D. And I don't like taking things. I just don't, even calcium and vitamin D. He wasn't very happy when we did a follow-up and I hadn't taken anything. So anyway, the point is, how much does that actually have an effect, calcium and vitamin D, intake over your life?
My position on this is that you need to have the building blocks there. So you have to have adequate calcium, because calcium is one of the building blocks for bone. So, people who are active, exercise will cause micro damage in bone that needs to be repaired. And even if you didn't do that, the skeleton is always in a state where about 10% of it is undergoing resorption. So, you turn over your skeleton maybe every 10 years. So you have to make sure you have adequate calcium to allow that process to proceed optimally. But just taking in more calcium doesn't necessarily mean you will build more bone. So it has to be adequate. And the adequate vitamin D is necessary because that's important for calcium absorption. So those are the two nutrients that are viewed as being critical to make sure they are sufficient to support the metabolic bone environment.
Yeah, it's funny, I don't know if I've got this wrong, but I remember I did nutrition during my undergrad, and there was talk about how when they give the recommended daily intakes, which is what we call in Australia, I think, is it the same in the US?
RDAs, recommended daily allowance, I think.
There you go. They actually build in 2 standard deviations above what they think you need to make sure they cover, 95% of people or whatever. And as soon as I heard that, that's probably had an effect on me. I'm like, almost by definition, you've got to have a lot of people that are below that because you've built in that big safety factor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'm sure it's not really the brief to talk about. But I know there's been some controversy about calcium, what calcium levels people should have, and whatever. So anyway, I got in trouble for not taking it. But strangely enough, when I did have my next step, so I'd gone from osteoporosis in my L4 and L5 to osteopenia. So it might have just been the measurement error. Well, this has been very interesting. I guess I'm still slightly confused. So, you said you're not that sure and in two minds about recommending exercise, but overall, when you look at DEXAs, without looking at CTX and things like that, when you look at DEXAs of people that exercise their whole lives, for example, do they tend to have higher bone mass? But I guess it's cross-sectional. You don't really know. You'd have to have like a long 20-year study or something. Or even just epidemiological studies. Yeah.
It's those observational studies. You always have to consider that they are observational. Can't confer cause and effect, but certain groups of athletes or people who participate in certain types of exercise do tend to have higher bone mineral density. The best type of activities seem to be those that involve jumping, sprinting, weightlifting. So gymnasts, probably because of the impact forces that they generate when landing from a vault or something. Basketball, volleyball players. So people who do more of a variety of types of movements seem to have higher BMD. But I will tell you, there's one study that was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I think back in the 1990s, that was of NCAA basketball players. This is one of the studies we cite to support our work, that followed basketball players initially over a year. And much like our study of competitive road cyclists, they didn't measure BMD, but they measured BMC, bone mineral content, total body bone mineral content. That decreased by 6% over 1 year in NCAA Division I basketball players. After they had seen that, they decided to follow them another year. And for that second year, they had them increase their calcium intake because they had measured dermal calcium loss and shown that it was very high in these basketball players. So they were kind of working on the same hypothesis that we were. And what I think is important about that study, because they did show that total body bone mineral content reversed the second year. They didn't get all the way back up to where they had started, but they at least had a small increase rather than a decrease. What I think was critical in that study is they actually found a way to get calcium into solution. And they had them, in addition to taking a calcium supplement at home, they had them drinking a calcium-enriched beverage during practices and before games. And I think that's critical because it would suggest that they were getting calcium in to the right place where it could be absorbed during the time when calcium homeostasis is disrupted, during vigorous exercise. So I think that study supports our scientific premise that the disruption of calcium homeostasis during exercise can be an important determinant of how bone responds acutely to exercise and probably also how it adapts over time.
Okay, so maybe in a knucklehead, not really supplementing calcium. Are you suggesting people should actually maybe supplement calcium, especially if they're doing prolonged sort of endurance exercise? Or
I'm not ready to make that recommendation yet. We've got to know whether that increase in PTH is generating an anabolic signal or just a catabolic signal. We know it's generating the catabolic signal, but I think the jury is still out. Even though I don't think the evidence points there, I want to finish our current study and make sure that it is not having more of an anabolic effect than I expect.
Okay. And is it fair to say, as you said, that studies like gymnastics, etc., activities like gymnastics, when you do have that high forces, it does seem to increase bone mass?
Well, we know that turns on bone formation. You know, that will happen regardless of what's happening on the resorption side with the acute catabolic effect.
And that's a local thing. So, for example, if you're jumping up and down on the spot, you will have increased bone mass in your legs, but not in your arms. It's not like a systemic effect. It's the actual forces on the bone.
Predominantly, yes. There might be some factors that can affect bone metabolism systemically, but I think they're small compared to the local effect of mechanical stress.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for coming on. I just thought if because I know you've been doing a lot of work on this MoTrPAC. Yeah. Did you want to just talk a little bit about your role in that and what it's about? Scott Trappy talked about that as well. I think it's amazing. You know, we're fighting. You know, all of us are fighting for scarce dollars, and you guys managed to get that going in the US for a while now. And I'm sure you're still fighting for scarce dollars, but that's a great injection from the NIH.
It is. So MoTrPAC, the Molecular Transducers of Physical Activity Consortium, is the premise for this, and this is an NIH Common Fund initiative, which means it's across all the institutes and centers, actually comes from the director's office. So Common Fund projects are not designed to test a hypothesis. They are designed to deliver a product. Our product that we're going to deliver to the scientific community is going to be this compendium of molecular factors that are up or down regulated in response to acute exercise and how they change with exercise training. So MoTrPAC has clinical sites. We've got 6 clinical centers, 9 clinical sites around the US. We have animal study sites, preclinical sites. Those are doing studies in rodents. We have a coordinating center that is managing all of our data capture and biospecimens and delivering those to all of the omics labs. We refer to them as the CAS, the chemical analysis sites, where they're doing genomics, epigenomics, proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, lipidomics, exosomics, just this wide panoply of omics platforms. And then we also have a bioinformatics center at Stanford that's going to be responsible for creating the interface for the scientific community and even citizen scientists to eventually be able to use all of the MoTrPAC data that are generated. So I'm a clinical site PI, clinical center PI in Colorado, but I also have the privilege of being the chair of the steering committee and the executive steering committee for the consortium. And I can tell you that the entire consortium is doing a remarkable job. This is going to be an extremely valuable data set that we deliver to the scientific community. For the human studies, we are getting blood, muscle, and adipose tissue before, blood during, not tissues during, and after exercise that we then send out for this array of omic analyses. So we're literally going to be generating tens of thousands of data points, I think, for each individual. The goal is to enroll 2 different cohorts of humans. We have, let's see, I don't ever remember if I include the kids in this. I think we're going to be enrolling over 2,000 humans. We have 1 clinical center that's focused on pediatrics. So we actually have 7 clinical centers, 1 pediatric, 6 adult. Pediatric site is at UC Irvine. They're doing only endurance exercise, not resistance, but the adult centers are doing both endurance and resistance. So we're all enrolling 2 cohorts. One cohort will already be highly active. They can be athletes or they can be lifelong exercisers that are doing predominantly either endurance or resistance exercise. The other larger cohort that we're assembling are more sedentary individuals who have not been doing regular exercise for an extended period of time. They come in, we do a lot of phenotyping at baseline. We do an acute exercise test. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And then they go through 12 weeks of training, either endurance, resistance. We've got a small no exercise control group. And then they repeat all the phenotyping at the end. Our acute exercise exposure is either 8 resistance exercises, total body, 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions. And after they do that, the leg press, I think, is the last exercise that they do. So they all have blood collection and muscle and fat biopsy before the acute test. And then they're randomized to get their post-exercise biopsies either shortly after that exercise bout, within about 30 minutes, or they're in what we call the mid group, where they wait 4 hours in the lab and have it 3.5 to 4 hours later, or they go home and come back 24 hours later. So we're developing this temporal profile of how all of the omics responses occur after exercise. Our highly active group actually gets hit with a lot of biopsies. They have muscle biopsies before, 30 minutes after, 3.5 hours after, and 24 hours after their exercise bouts. But they don't have to come back and repeat that after 12 weeks of training. We thought if we did that with our sedentary participants, we would lose a lot of volunteers who wouldn't want to go through that twice. So they each only get 2 muscle and 2 fat biopsies before training, and then they repeat that after training.
Okay.
So, I see the value of this for anybody interested in molecular signaling factors and exercise will have access to this enormous database to use as preliminary data to develop hypotheses. The goal of this is to increase our understanding of the molecular mechanisms responsible for the health benefits of exercise, because we know very little about that. And one thing that I envision is that, any new drug that comes to market now, most new drugs that come to market, they have to know what the mechanism is. They know what molecular factors are being targeted by these drugs. So Glenn, if you were on hypertension drug A that we know hits molecular target X, and we now in MoTrPAC show that exercise, either resistance or endurance, also targets molecular factor X, clinicians will now have more of an evidence base to know whether exercise can be an effective alternative therapeutic strategy to pharmacologic agents based on mechanisms of action.
Absolutely. And as you would know, of course, that the effects of the drugs are nothing like as comprehensive as the exercise. So you take a drug that affects blood pressure, take a drug that affects this and that. The exercise is hitting all sorts of things.
Yes, many benefits.
To convert it. All right, so how about if I'd like to do like a bit of a takeaway message, a bit of a bottom line at the end about the effects of exercise on bone. I wonder if you can give us a few takeaway messages here.
Yeah, based on everything I've said, people might come away thinking that I believe exercise is not good for bone, and that's not the case at all. I think exercise or being physically active is absolutely essential to bone health, because we know what happens with bed rest or with exposure to microgravity. The bone loss and the loss of bone integrity, bone strength, is profound. So being physically active is essential. I think where we are as a community, we referring to exercise physiologists and people interested in bone metabolism in general, I think we have to know much more about how to optimize the bone response in a way that will make sure that we are enhancing and not causing a detrimental effect on bone. So we've got to know much more about how these acute responses change over time, how different types of exercise might affect this in differential ways. We just need to really fine-tune exercise prescriptions for bone health. And I'm just going to mention this because it's not my area of research, but there have been several studies, observational studies, a handful of them now, showing that endurance athletes tend to have high coronary artery calcification scores. And I've talked to a few of my friends who are cardiologists, but also exercise physiologists, Ben Levine, Bill Krause, Paul Thompson, and others, about the possibility that this huge increase in calcium flux that we see out of the vascular space early in exercise, and then presumably coming back into the vascular space after exercise is finished, whether that could affect the calcification of atherosclerotic plaque and be a mechanistic cause for what's being observed in athletes. I mean, Ben Levine has published an intriguing observational paper suggesting that this calcified plaque may be benign, doesn't result in increased morbidity or mortality. I'd like to know a little bit more about that before I think we need to study that more vigorously, because it might not just, what we are observing might not affect just bone. I'm worried that it might also be affecting the vasculature. So I just think it has, as science usually does, led to more questions than answers. And we need a lot of people working in this area. So I hope other people get as enthused about this as I am, that will carry this research forward.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on. And it's been great. I've learned a lot. So thanks, and see you later.
Thanks for the invitation, Glenn. It's been fun to talk about this with you.
Yeah, okay. See you. Bye.
All right.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please like, subscribe, pass it on to your friends and colleagues. Check out the other podcasts. Thanks again.